Well, I think we've got Nick back with us. Nick, you there?
Yeah, I wasn't abducted. Don't worry. I think it was just a phone glitch.
Yeah, we were wondering about that. Hey, welcome back, man. It's good to have you back on the program. Got all this nice intro, and then no Nick, and I didn't catch it, so sorry about that, but it's good to have you.
Problem.
So tell us, starting off, your book, when did it come out?
It came out about 2 months ago, and it's called the NASA Conspiracies, and as you can probably guess by its title, it's basically a study of chiefly sort of UFO-related issues relative to NASA, but also some other, sort of cover-up and conspiracy issues that still weird, but not necessarily, UFO-related. But and what I tried to do with the book was, there've been a lot of books written solely on things like the face on Mars or, the issue of did we or didn't we go to the moon. But what I tried to do with this one was sort of present to the reader evidence that, although those are, I suppose, primary areas of research with respect to NASA, there's actually a lot more going on as well with respect to UFOs, alien abductions, contactee cases, all sorts of things.
That's, a fascinating topic. Obviously, there's been a lot of, ton of controversy about all of it. So, what got you into this? I mean, what got you in this part?
I think more than anything else, what it was that over the years, when you write stuff or you go to conferences and people tell you stories and things like this, when I was sort of casting around for ideas for another book and going through files and notes and things, I found that I'd got a lot of leads on NASA-related stories. Say, for example, far more new leads than I would have on, CIA or, whoever. And the important thing was that most of these stories were, certainly a lot of the witness cases were sort of brand new. And, I think that's always an important thing, is that if you're going to write a book, you don't want to just go over old ground. You want to be able to bring something new for people to read. And because I've got all these sort of new stories, new cases and files, I thought, well, why not put a book out on this particular subject? And, hopefully it will inform people, but at the same time, maybe it'll bring in further information where people can sort of validate some of the accounts in the book and, add more to the stories, etc.
So where do you start out in the book? What topic area?
Well, I guess what I try to do with the book is sort of present it chronologically for the most part. So it begins with the early formative years of NASA. And what basically happened was that, in October 1957, the Soviets launched Sputnik 1, which sort of pretty much sent the entire Western world into shock. The Russians had actually launched a vehicle into space. And then, of course, the Russians got the first animal into space, and then the first man into space, the first astronaut, Yuri Gagarin. But even though, the Russians sort of did that first, the Russian space program was only actually very slightly ahead of the American one. There have been plans for a number of years for the U.S. government to create, some sort of space agency. And there actually was like a predecessor which was involved in sort of high altitude and rocketry-based research. It was called the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics. But that was then sort of reworked and remodeled into NASA. And basically by July 1958, what was called the National Aeronautics and Space Act had been created and then, gave birth to NASA. Now, obviously the public face of NASA during that period was that, we're going to go out into space, we're going to explore the moon and hopefully one day the planets and, do good scientific investigation, which certainly NASA has done. But behind the scenes, there was far more going on, a lot of intriguing stuff. For example, at the very dawning of the creation of NASA, they actually contracted with the Brookings Institute to prepare a report, which basically was like a long-term study on the part of the Brookings Institute, where they interviewed somewhere in the region of 200 people in different disciplines like science, technology, future technologies, future trends, that sort of thing. And it was sort of like a document, a lengthy document that was for the attention of NASA and saying, hey, these are the challenges you may have to face in the coming years. One section of the report, I should say, stands out because it deals with the implications for if and when NASA should one day uncover or meet alien life. And the document's important because it talks about not when the general public should be told that alien life's been found, but even if the general public should be told that alien life has been found. And there's a lot of sort of forward thinking in this document because it talks about the stuff that is actually sort of widespread in today's ufological world. You know, the idea of how would it impact sociologically, economically, from a religious perspective. Would we, as a society, sort of lose our identity because we would be, you know, sort of taken over, not necessarily in sinister fashion, but taken over and absorbed into sort of this massively advanced culture, and we would lose our identity. So all these issues are brought up, and it's intriguing that, you know, if you look at this document, it's pretty clear that it sort of laid the groundwork for the way in which NASA has sort of handled or tried to steer itself away from the UFO controversy over the years. You know, it has sort of played it down and denied it in the same way that, you know, the Brookings report talks about, well, you know, if we tell the public, if we say this, etc., etc.
Interesting. So, in your research, let's get into the moon landings. What did you uncover anything?
Well, you know, I mean,
interesting
with the book,
there.
Yeah, I mean, the book is called the NASA Conspiracies because it's a study of conspiracy theories leveled at NASA. But what I tried to do with the book was look at all the various conspiracy theories with a, you know, hopefully a level head and an open mind, rather than, you know, just like an open jaw, if you like, or a hanging jaw. And so I tried to look at them all from the perspective of, you know, how much evidence is there for and against this angle, etc., etc. Now, with the moon landings, I actually do think we did go to the moon. Now, you know, I'm sure there are people listening right now who said, oh, you know, Nick's an apologist for NASA or whatever, you know, or being paid on the side by NASA to say, you know, but which isn't true, of course. It's just, you know, I look at conspiracy theories, and if I see a conspiracy, I'll say so. And if I think the conspiracy theory isn't valid, then I'll also say so. But I will be the first to admit that the idea that we didn't go to the moon actually has a huge following. For example, in 1999, a Gallup poll was initiated all across the US, and which demonstrated that 6% of the US population didn't believe we actually went to the moon. 6% of the population in 1999 was actually just under 18 million people. Now, that is sort of a significant number of people in the US alone, never mind the rest of the world. You know, 18 million people is like the size of a country. You know, a small country.
No kidding.
And I think, well, I mean, I know there are several reasons why, you know, there's a belief system that we didn't go. One is the sheer practicality of it, you know, that people have said, well, President Kennedy announced the plan to go to the moon in 1962, and his plan was we're going to get there before 1970, which is what happened. But people have said, well, could we have developed the technology and the rockets and, you know, send the astronauts there and have everything go right and have them land, get perfect photographs and come back unscathed, all in one piece? You know, people have said it's too far out in just 7.5 years to do that. You know, it's but then other people have said, well, you know, at the height of the Second World War, when we were sort of fighting the Nazis, you know, there were tremendous steps made in technology to fight a war. And here, although this was like a scientific mission, it was still a deep game of like one-upmanship with the Russians, you know,
right.
To sort of put the fear in each other that we're ahead of you, you know, and vice versa. So, you know, in other words, you have that angle to deal with. I think for me, some of the evidence that sort of persuades me we did go to the moon is the fact that, you know, we have a substantial amount of moon rock
right.
that the astronauts brought back with them, which is clear, which has been sort of analysed outside of NASA, and it's clearly, you know, not terrestrial. And one of the biggest things a lot of people don't really think about is that we know today that, you know, in the same way that America has spy satellites and systems spying on the Russians and the Chinese, etc., they do vice versa. We know that the Russians were very, very closely monitoring the entire Apollo mission and the, you know, the signals and the messages back and forth and the conversations. My personal view is that had the Russians even got the slightest inkling that the moon landings were hoaxed, they would have said so, because it would have just brought the whole U.S. space program to a grinding halt, and probably would have destroyed any faith that the American people had in its own government.
Yeah.
If it was, you know what I mean?
No, absolutely.
The very fact that the Russians didn't say anything, but they were closely monitoring it, does lead me to believe the missions did go ahead. But I mean, I'll be the first to admit there are plenty of people who disagree with me, and there's a whole culture and a whole movement around these issues.
There are, but I'm with you. I think we did go to the moon, and if you did mention this, please forgive me. I was busy kicking a spammer out of the chat room. But what do you make of the pictures?
Well, this is another interesting area. I mean, some people have said, yes, we went to the moon, but maybe, that isn't, the story isn't as straightforward as that. Some people say, the photographs, some of them look just too good. A lot of people don't realize, the astronauts, when they were handling the cameras, they had bulky gloves on. They weren't even holding the cameras. Mm-hmm. The cameras were actually fixed to their chest. Mm-hmm. They had like a device fixed in there, so you kind of got to look down and then take the photograph. And some of them, they look picture perfect. They're exceptional photographs.
Field of view and all.
Yeah, exactly. And they seem nicely lit. And one of the sort of side offshoots, if you like, of the main theory that we didn't go is that we did go, but that possibly with the rigors of outer space radiation and problems and who knows what, that a lot of the photographs didn't come out properly. And the other theory is that were they possibly recreated on Earth? Because if the astronauts went and there were no photographs, well, then it's a case of how do you actually prove we went, But again, if it was proven that even one photograph was fake, it would throw into doubt the entire mission. But again, I will be the first to admit that, some of the photographs people have pointed out that there seem to be extra light sources instead of just the sun, that would reflect off the moon's surface. It's almost, some people have said, like there are spotlights showing. And, this is why I think, why this entire controversy, I don't think will ever really be laid to rest until probably like an independent nation goes back to the moon and possibly lands in the same area and photographs it and says, here are the lunar modules, or in a worst case scenario, says we've looked and they're not there,
Right.
I think that's the only way it's really going to be laid to rest.
Well, I know that the pictures, I've looked at these in times past very, very much in depth, and the pictures just don't stand. They just don't stand up. In fact, there's the same background from two different missions, and they just don't stand to scrutiny. But I agree. I think we did go to the moon, and I think that there was a problem with the pictures, and they had to produce something, so they were possibly recreated. There's also another thing in and I'm sure you addressed this, is Neil Armstrong's silence.
Yeah, there's no doubt that, a lot of the astronauts in general who went to the moon came back sort of profoundly changed. There's no doubt about that. Some of them barely spoke about the missions again. Others of them, started developing interests in, alternative areas like UFOs and psychic phenomena.
Agrimitchell,
Yeah, they were radically changed by their experiences. You have to wonder what it was that prompted that. There is talk, for example, I mentioned this in the book, the story of a man named Carl Wolf, who served in the U.S. Air Force in the 1960s. And in 1965, he was actually assigned to a mission at Langley Air Force Base, Virginia, which was working on NASA's Lunar Orbiter program. He got speaking with a guy on the project who told him or confided in him information about how supposedly on the far side of the moon, NASA orbiters orbiting the moon itself had actually photographed what looked like some sort of, in simple terms, like a moon base, which clearly wasn't ours or the Russians or anybody's back in 65. It was obviously somebody else's. Now, Carl Wolf was told this story and thought, wow, this is going to be big news, imminently, and he waited and waited and waited, and of course nothing surfaced. And then the realization hit home that, well, whatever those photographs show, somebody's taken a decision not to reveal them. Now, if that story's true, and Carl Wolf is a very credible military source, there's no reason for him to fabricate a story like this. My view is that possibly there could have been people within NASA, within the government, who knew, obviously because they got the photographs, and perhaps the moon missions were little more than like a quick hop, skip, and a jump, and then back again, because the moon was already somebody else's territory. Because if you look back at the early years of the Apollo program, you know, the long-range plans were that after the Apollo missions, then there would be like a follow-up program where we would perhaps build something like the equivalent of a North Pole outpost, South Pole outpost. Then we would add to it. Then eventually there would be like a permanent presence, you know, sort of people going up and shuttle back and forth, etc. And then we would expand upon it and possibly even use it as a staging post to launch perhaps like a nuclear-powered rocket to Mars. But all this just came to a grinding halt after Apollo. It was like when the Apollo missions were done, we just went back to near-Earth orbit programs like Skylab,
right,
and then the space shuttle. You know, these long-range missions to go back to the moon, set up a permanent presence, were just gone. You know, you have to wonder, was it something like these photographs that prompted a decision that, well, you know, we'll go there and it's the prestige of saying we've done it, and then let's get the hell back quickly, you know.
Well, some can speculate that we were warned away.
Yes.
What do you make of that?
Well, again, I mean, there's a lot of stories like that about, you know, the astronauts reportedly seeing, you know, craft on the moon, etc. And I mean, granted, a lot of the stories haven't been vindicated or validated by the astronauts, and in many cases, they vehemently denied them. But that hasn't stopped the stories from circulating. Now, as I said with Carl Wolf's story, that one is one which he absolutely supports. You know, he's like, you know, I was told this story. You know, I was told by an operative at Langley Air Force Base that these photographs of this structured city, almost, if you like, on the far side of the moon existed. So, you know, it's one thing to have complete silence on the one hand, but then people like Carl Wolf coming forward on the other. You know, we have to look, I think, from the perspective that somebody knew somewhere that there was something going on the moon that had nothing to do with us, and that I actually do think in some respects that had a bearing on the extent to which we've explored the moon, or rather haven't explored it.
Here's a question from the chat room. What do you think of those people who say it would be impossible for humans to survive the Van Allen radiation belt?
Well, you know, I mean, again, I mean, there's, you know, people talked about whether or not, quite rightly, you know, the astronauts physically would be able to sort of withstand, you know, the Van Allen belt, radiation, etc. It is a fact that a number of the astronauts who went to the moon have suffered from early-stage cataracts, which, you know, is a sign of harsh exposure. For example, if there'd ever been a nuclear war between, you know, the East and the West, you can read declassified documents that talk about sort of the long-range health of the people who would survive. You know, it'd be down to, you know, a small fraction of people, but they talk about how cataracts would be one of the problems that the survivors would face. You know, that you have a whole race of survivors who, perhaps over 10 years, would lose 50-60% of their eyesight. And a lot of the NASA astronauts did suffer from cataracts. So, in other words, I think there is evidence that to show that the astronauts actually were adversely affected. And again, that's why I think, you know, we did go. But on the other hand, the big question is not, to me, not whether they went or not, but whether we've been told the entire story of what happened up there, and whether we've been told the entire story of the photographs and the film footage.
Do you have any idea what the total story is? Why they would keep that from us? Well,
my view would be that it would have, I don't think, you know, it would just be the case of there were certain classified aspects of the missions. I think it'd be more along the lines of something was found, possibly even before we went, you know, like these photographs that Carl Wolf talked about. And I think possibly the secrecy stems from the fact that there's something up there that doesn't belong to us. And it's issues and it's areas like that that have led to certain aspects of the missions not being fully disclosed, or even disclosed at all. So.
Well, doesn't Richard Hoagland talk about structures on the moon?
Oh, yeah, I mean, there's a lot of photographs, even ones that have been declassified by NASA, that seem to show very odd structures. You know, there's one or two that look like almost looked like a stone telephone pole almost, like tall
or monolith
towers.
or something.
Monoliths, yeah. Now, it's very difficult to understand how, on a body like the moon, how nature could kind of sculpt or create something like that. I mean, what would it take to do that? It's difficult to understand. So when you have these sort of monolithic type, formations, granted, we don't have sort of really close-up photographs to see what they are, but on the other hand, they're strange enough to definitely suggest, they may be artificial in nature. They look very, very weird. And these, of course, are the only ones we know about.
Right.
I mean, how many photographs were possibly censored before declassification or have never even come up for declassification?
So there's been a number of different structures claimed from a base or several bases on the dark side.
Yeah, some people talk about, like the photographs that Carl Wolf was told about. The guy who told him was clearly talking about not like, a 200,000-year-old construction, like a very ancient equivalent of the pyramids, with damage to them or anything like that. He was talking about something that looked in operation, that looked technologically sophisticated, etc. So, in other words, we seem to be having a combination of what do look like old, monolith-type structures, but on the other hand, other things that seem to suggest not just bases, but some authors and researchers have suggested like large-scale mining equipment and things like that. So in other words, it's maybe the moon is somebody else's property, and we realised that when we got there, and it really was a case of getting up there, having the prestige of the missions, and then getting away before, anything hit the fan, so to speak.
Of course, there's always a legend of the 2 or 3 spaceships or UFOs watching the Apollo 11 landing. Yeah, I looked into that, and I mean, I have to say, although it's a fascinating story, it's difficult to vindicate that, and of course the NASA astronauts have outright, they have not commented on it, they've actually denied it, and I think it's an area where it's an intriguing story, but, it's one of these things where, for me at least, I always try and go with evidence and something I can prove. That doesn't mean there could not be anything to it. It just means so far, we're still digging for anything that might support it or otherwise. Here's a question from the Inception Radio Network chat room. Have you looked into the Phobos 2 mystery?
Not to a great extent, but I mean, there's certainly, Phobos, one of the Martian moons, we have a lot of weird stories, coming out from Mars and the moons, etc. Rumors about possibly the moons being hollow, things like this, and the idea of, again, advanced technologies on the Martian surface. But it was one of these things where, with the book, I was strictly limited by the publisher to 60,000 words, and that was it. So it was like 60,000 or else. So what I tried to do was not sort of, as I said, go over too much that had been discussed before, which I knew was being sort of heavily, researched and written about in other people's good books. And so I thought, I'll focus on other areas, and hopefully, the collective body of material will offer something rather than, just going over old ground of what other people had already written about. So.
Well, you mentioned the hollow moon, and Jim Marrs, in his book Alien Agenda, had talked about that, where they have done those experiments and the moon rings. Impacts.
Oh, yeah, I mean, there's no doubt about that, that these experiments, the sort of the so-called bell ringing on the moon, etc., there's no doubt that this has convinced a lot of people that whether or not the moon's hollow, but certainly could have vast underground caverns and things like that. Now, I think if there's obviously clearly a UFO presence on the Earth, there's no doubt about that, which has nothing to do with us, it really is from somewhere else. People often say, well, how do they travel the vast distances from point A to point B, the nearest star system? Well, what if they're not? What if they do actually have like staging posts within our solar system, where the Mars, the Moon, there's sometimes a tendency to think if we find ancient structures on Mars, they're actually built by ancient indigenous races. But what if they're built by beings that, essentially commandeer planets as they go from solar system to solar system and, actually use them as outposts rather than having to sort of, travel the vast distances back to point A from point B.
So interesting. So a lot of obviously unanswered questions regarding the moon. And,
there's no doubt about that.
And you've also done, obviously, your book, and frankly, it's a good time to mention your book again, the NASA Conspiracies, The Truth Behind the Moon Landing, Censored Photos, and the Face on Mars. And just real quick, Nick, where can they get your book? What can our listeners do?
All good outlets, online outlets like Amazon or bookstores, Barnes & Noble, Borders, places like that.
Okay, and your website?
nickredfern.com.
Okay, good. So you've looked into the face on Mars. What's your take on that?
Yeah, I mean, the face on Mars to me is one of the more important issues relative to to NASA and the search for alien life. The face on Mars, I'm sure most of your listeners have heard of it, but for those who haven't, it's located in an area of Mars called Cydonia, which is roughly about 10 degrees north of the Martian equator. It was actually first photographed on July the 25th, 1976, by NASA's Viking 1 space probe. And it looks, for all the world, like a face, like a huge carved face staring up from the Martian surface. Now, NASA itself doesn't actually avoid talking about the face at all, but their public viewpoint is that it's kind of like the equivalent of seeing faces in clouds. Their view is that when the shadows and the rocks and the light, etc. Yes, exactly. That it looks like a face. But when I was doing the research for the book, I liaised and interviewed quite extensively some of the leading players within the Face on Mars community, the research community, and quoted Mac Tonis quite extensively, who wrote a book back in 2004 after the Martian apocalypse. And having addressed all the testimony, all the evidence, the arguments for and against, etc., there's very little doubt, if indeed any, in my mind, that what we're seeing really is some sort of ancient carved structure. Now, I don't dispute that it probably is originally some huge mesa, but it looks like it's been sort of remodeled or resculpted using some sort of mega-scale engineering, take a natural rock formation and then resculpt it. And I think that's what happened. Now, what's more intriguing, or equally intriguing, is that quite literally, almost like a stone's throw away from the face, you have what eerily look like, sort of badly damaged, eroded pyramids. And when you see these photographs, which NASA has also released, it's difficult, again, to reconcile these pyramid formations with the idea that they were done purely by nature, by wind blasts or whatever. I mean, they looked like pyramids. Now, people say, well, if these were built by indigenous Martians or whoever, why aren't we seeing them? Where's the evidence of their culture, etc., other than this? Now, the important thing to note is that most people within the Face on Mars research community don't conclude that we're talking about the face having been made, 5,000-10,000 years ago. We could be talking, as some of the people think, 200,000, 500,000 years ago. And if that was the case, Mars may well have been very different to the way it is today. I mean, regardless of the Face on Mars controversy, if you look at a lot of the photographs that have come back from Mars, whether by the Americans or the Russians, we see what looks like evidence of ancient shorelines, massive shorelines, which are suggestive of either huge lakes or even oceans. We know that at the North and South Pole, there's a substantial amount of frozen water. There's even photographs that NASA has declassified of what looks like vegetation. They become known as banyan trees. If you Google Mars plus banyan trees, you see these pictures that look like weird vegetation. So in other words, if, against all the odds, some sort of life, rudimentary or otherwise, has survived on Mars, then it's entirely possible that in its distant past, perhaps it was very Earth-like. Now, of course, we're speculating to a degree, but my personal view is that at some point in Mars's ancient past, given the fact that I believe the face to be a carved structure, it clearly must have had an atmosphere and an intelligent population and a culture and a civilization. But something must have happened that sort of catastrophically destroyed, I guess, the Martian atmosphere. Whether it was some sort of impact from a comet or, something, who knows, but something happened where clearly there was a devastating worldwide process of destruction. And arguably, it might well be the case that the only things that really would survive would be the larger creations of this civilization that were rigidly stuck in the ground. In other words, if this was a real mesa, then the cataclysm may not have been enough to destroy mountains, if you like. In other words, so the face would have survived, whereas perhaps buildings and things wouldn't have. So I think that's an important factor. And of course, one of the biggest implications of all this is that, as many researchers have rightly pointed out, the face eerily parallels the appearance of the Egyptian Sphinx.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, when we have pyramid-like formations near the face on Mars and pyramid formations near the Sphinx in Egypt, this has inevitably given rise to the idea that perhaps when Mars was spiraling down to destruction, that some of the original Martian entities escaped from Mars, and made their way here, and possibly even influenced some of our early cultures. Because we know, not just the Egyptians, but like the Mayans, the Incas, they had pyramid-like structures as well. You have to wonder, did somebody come here as like a last refuge as their planet spiraled into destruction, managed to survive and thrive? They were significantly physically, genetically close enough to us that they could live here, and possibly even, even reproduce with us. Who knows? But even if we don't go that far, maybe they influenced us, and that's why we're seeing similarities in our early architecture with theirs. And I think one of the most important factors in all this is if we look at our present-day civilization, developed very, very slowly and progressively. You went from having the wheel to, horses and carts and steam, and then the industrial age, and then the atomic age, etc. But with the Egyptians, for example, it was like they suddenly surfaced almost out of nowhere.
Right.
As if suddenly, you had
Sumerians.
You had like a relatively primitive species that was suddenly handed on a plate, the secrets of how to build massive structures out of rocks weighing literally tons and tons. It's like, rather than them developing it slowly over time. So, I have to wonder if the face on Mars doesn't just represent the last remains of some ancient Martian civilization, but it may actually represent the people who seeded civilization here. And arguably, if there are people within NASA or the government who know this or even suspect it, the mere fact that it would overwhelm and, create a huge upheaval in our archaeological society, our history, maybe even our religions, would be a very good reason to deny the face any sort of validity.
Well, the face is only part of Cydonia, right?
Yes.
It's only part of the compelling evidence for the whole area of Cydonia. The pyramids, and I know Hoagland's gone into some different, what's the word I want? Some percentages from some geographical locations, some distances, some correlations, and that sort of a thing. So, it's obviously a fascinating thing, and that's the problem with all this. You've got all this, which is really kind of circumstantial evidence, but it's so compelling because when you add up all the little pieces, it seems to point in a direction, like what you were just talking about. You've got this pyramid, you've got the Sphinx-like face, you've got these stone structures, and then all of a sudden, Egypt and ancient cultures explode onto the scene with this technology.
No, you're right. I think, it's like if you have just one thing, well, then people are going to argue left, right, and center. But when you have the face, and then you have the pyramids, and then you have other structures in the area, and then you find evidence of water, and then you find evidence of what looks like weird vegetation, it's like, how much more evidence do we need to suggest that Mars may not even now be a dead world, and in its past it certainly probably was never a dead world. I think it's the sheer wealth of evidence also emanating from one particular area that, to me, adds even more weight to the theory. Now, one of the interesting things about the photographs, etc., is that in 1998, NASA actually revealed new photographs of the face on Mars. This was photographs actually taken by the Mars Global Surveyor. A lot of people don't realize that when these photographs were taken and they were released to the world, a lot of people were disappointed because they didn't show the clear imagery of the face that some of the earlier ones did. But what actually happened was that a lot of people don't know that the NASA subjected the images to what's called a high-pass filter, and this actually makes the photographs look more vague rather than make them more delineated. And I interviewed Mac Tonis about this, and his exact words were, I'll quote them for you, "This was almost certainly done as a deliberate attempt to nullify public interest in a feature that the space agency is determined to ignore. So yes, there is a cover-up of sorts, but it's in plain view for anyone who cares to look into the matter objectively. I could speculate endlessly on the forms a more nefarious cover-up might take, but the fact remains that the surveyor continues to return high-resolution images. However, as I said, the ones of the face actually look pretty vague, and were actually made to look vague, which, you have to wonder why would that be done, unless it was to try and, deny any significance to the face."
Yeah, it's obviously a fascinating area. And you look at the whole of it, I guess, Mars, the moon, and you bring that back to, the point of your book, the NASA Conspiracies, and, it all fits. Why, and that's the thing that obviously frustrates most of us is, look, it is what it is. Don't hide the truth from us. Well, and they're all worried, like the Brookings report wasn't, and people can't handle it. Well, you know what? It is what it is.
Yeah, I actually think we would handle it. I mean, it's like from the end of the Second World War onwards, we all sort of everybody in the world lived under the fear that one day there was going to be a Third World War. And everybody knew that if the Third World War kicked off, no one was going to win. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. But we all got on with our lives. Nobody sort of ran into mental hospitals and nervous breakdowns, worrying every day that the Third World War was going to break. You just hoped it didn't happen. And I think it would be the same thing if a revelation was made that aliens exist, and maybe we don't know what their intent is, and maybe it's hostile, maybe it's not. People would acclimatize that into their lives anyway. After probably it would be shock and amazement for like months. Mm-hmm. And then sort of 6 months down the line, it would be like, well, who's going to win American Idol? Do you know what I mean? people would go back to their day-to-day lives, but they would accommodate it into it. My personal view is that the secrecy doesn't just stem from the fact that the announcement that UFOs exist or alien life exists. I think that the reluctance to come forward is because those people in the know have some sort of awareness that if they reveal the full story, it will have an impact on our ancient histories, our cultures, possibly even our religious beliefs. It's like, for example, let's say hypothetically that Martians did come here when their planet, was destroyed or, spiraled into destruction however many thousands of years ago. And let's say that some of our ancient stories of the gods coming down actually have nothing to do with gods. They have to do with astronauts from another world trying to save themselves as their planet, teeters on the brink of destruction. I think it's things like this, the way in which it could rewrite our history books and blow, accepted teachings out of the window. I think it's these knock-on effects rather than just the mere fact that aliens exist that is the reason for the secrecy.
I think Brian's got a question on the space program.
Well, a quick comment on that. We're always rewriting our own history. I mean, our history books lie about all kinds of things. Yeah. And I was reading about in Cuba, they teach that the Americans did fabricate the moon landings.
Yeah, that's right. They do. They teach that in schools. It's like one of their regular teachings. But no, you're right. I think I think what it comes down to is sort of the arrogance of probably a small group of people who've decided they know what's best for us. And for me, regardless of what the truth is and the implications of the whole UFO phenomenon, nobody should have the right to decide that the rest of the planet doesn't know that life exists elsewhere. It's like one of the most profound discoveries ever. And, for a select group of a couple of hundred people on some super secret project to say, hey, we're not going to tell them, screw them, to me that's wrong. We should be told. So.
I agree, 1,000%. So, Brian, you had a question on the secret space program?
I got a question about the we're on the eve of the space shuttle program. It's going to be gone pretty soon. Only 2 more missions. What are your thoughts on the secret space program going on simultaneously with this?
Yeah, well, this is a very interesting
how does that fit in with the cover-up?
Well, yeah, I mean, this is a very interesting area of research. The idea that if you look back at when the Apollo missions ended in '72. Since then, NASA's done some very good stuff, but, we've had Skylab and we've had the space shuttle. The big question is, 40 years after we landed men on the moon, is the space shuttle the best thing we've got? That's the big question. Or is there more that we don't know about? Now, of course, if there is a secret space program, ironically, NASA may not be a part of it. It could possibly be something, more of the domain of the military. That there's certainly been deep plans for years to sort of militarize outer space, rather than just have it as a scientific area of research. So, it could be something that's like a deep project to the military. But, I mean, one of the areas, or one of the stories, which is highly relative to this, is the story of a British man named Gary McKinnon, a computer hacker who faces extradition to the US for hacking into NASA. What he basically did, he hacked into the Johnson Space Center in Houston, Texas, in search of classified information on UFOs. And what had happened was in 2001, a woman named Donna Hare, who'd worked for a NASA contractor called Philco, told a story as to how she had reportedly been told by one of the people who worked in the Space Center that part of his job was to airbrush and censor NASA photographs before they were released into the public domain, to essentially airbrush out anomalies. And one of the ones that he told her about, or showed her, actually, was showed a classic flying saucer in the photograph, and it was his job to remove that from the image before it was released. Donna Hare went public with this story, and then Gary McKinnon said, wow, that's very interesting. If it's supposedly held in this specific building that Donna Hare said it was held in, his view was, I'm going to go looking for it in this specific building. And McKinnon went looking and said, when he hacked into NASA, this is all public domain, by the way, he said that what he did, he went into the files, saw photographs of some very weird objects that, didn't look like satellites or rockets. But he said he also saw a reference to documents that mentioned something called non-terrestrial officers, which is sort of very weird terminology. Non-terrestrial sounds like off the planet,
right.
And officers almost sounds like, like a military fleet, non-terrestrial officers. And it kind of provoked imagery of, like the equivalent of a super secret outer space equivalent of an aircraft carrier or something like that. The military personnel working off the planet. Now, of course, the McKinnon himself read all the material online. He didn't download and print anything off. But certainly since that particular date, this when he was doing this, it's almost reached soap opera proportions where, nobody, even his legal team, don't deny that he sort of broke the law and it was inevitable he was going to get punished. The big question is where should he be tried? It's like he committed a crime in Britain, but it was targeted against the US. So it's kind of like a grey area as to how and where the crime was actually committed. But regardless of the outcome, it's ironic that had it all been wrapped up quickly in 2001, 2002, and he was offered, a 12-month suspended sentence or whatever, probably no one would have even heard of Gary McKinnon and these stories about secret space programs and non-terrestrial officers, because he was actually also looking for secret technology that was being denied reportedly to the general public, but that the government was supposedly working on, and that kept it just in the hands of the elite. So ironically, the fact that this whole saga is going on for so long has actually brought a tremendous amount of publicity to his story, and numerous people have tried to track down who or what this reference to non-terrestrial officers means. But the only thing people can really come up with is that it is what it sounds like. It's like a fleet listing of personnel who are working off the planet in some sort of clandestine program.
Was that was Serpo, wasn't it?
Well, I mean, people have speculated about that. I mean, Serpo is this story about supposedly how there was like an exchange mission between
right,
like aliens and astronauts on the Earth to go to be swapped on each other's planets, if you like. But this is kind of more, I guess, like the way it's being interpreted is like a clandestine space program, where people are talking about us actually going back to the moon, or even who knows, having sent craft to Mars. I mean, it sounds outlandish, but the idea that if there is a cover-up of the face on Mars, then the only reason I can see that a cover-up would really be instigated to a deep level is if somebody's gone there and they know full well that what we're seeing is artificial. It's kind of like if the only evidence that exists is photographs and we just cannot get there yet, then NASA's quite safe in saying, oh, it's just tricks of the light.
Sure.
There's nothing to lose. But if they actually know by having flown clandestine missions that there's far more to it, then the stakes go much higher, and you can understand the reason why, there'll be more of a drive to keep all this under wraps.
Yeah, interesting. Anything else, Brian, on that? Well, I have, there's been some conjecture that there's actually been a military moon base since like the 60s.
Yeah, no, you're quite right. I mean, what's interesting is that to a degree, we have actually background to this story because through the Freedom of Information Act, documents have actually surfaced from the U.S. Army, sort of like plans and guidelines and blueprints for their plans to actually build a moon base. The idea was that, again, to militarize space, to show like military superiority, and possibly even, if it was feasible, to install nuclear weaponry, pointing down at the Soviet Union or whatever from the moon. Now, to an extent, this would be like a psychological thing, it'd be like every time the Russians looked up in the sky, they'd know that there were X number of missiles pointing down at them.
Yeah.
It's kind of different than if you try and imagine they're in a silo on the other side of the world, where every time you look up, they're pointing down at you. But, the interesting thing is that the plans for the U.S. Army to have this moon base, if you like, were actually first created long before NASA was created. There are actually feasibility studies done of, hey, one day, is it possible we could have a moon base? It's long before, NASA was anything more than sort of a dream in somebody's mind. So, the idea that deep plans were initiated as to how, for example, how would you get water, recycling oxygen, that sort of thing, how would we get the parts up there, and how long would it take to build something, and then we could add to it, etc. If this was going on in the early 60s, talking about it, I really do find it difficult to reconcile the fact that, the last manned mission to the moon next year will be 40 years ago, and the best thing we have now is a space shuttle, which really only actually goes up like about 200 miles, and then it releases satellites that go higher into orbit or probes into space. But the shuttle itself, only goes a couple of 100 miles into space.
Right.
It's like, it's a great craft, and it's, people should be proud of what it's achieved. But 40 years after we put men on the surface of the moon, the best we've got is a vehicle that just goes a couple of 100 miles into space. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, that doesn't make sense.
It's like, to me, it's like we should be far more in advance of that by now. And maybe the answer is that we really are. But for the most part, the general public's just not seeing it.
There's a question in the chat room. What about the idea the moon was built and brought here? Kind of goes back to Jim Mars.
Yeah. Well, that's actually a very interesting theory, because one of the reasons being that the moon is perfectly positioned in relation to the Earth and the Sun, so that when we get like an eclipse, the Sun is completely blotted out.
Yeah.
You know, it's although the Sun is obviously massively bigger than the Moon and the Earth, you know, you can fit literally hundreds of the Earth, you know, into the Sun. But the positioning, actually, the Moon and the Sun are pretty much identical in size because of the closeness, proximity of the Moon and the distance of the Sun. And, you know, it's like, what are the chances of these two aerial bodies that, you know, dominate our skyline of being exactly the same size, pretty much to the naked eye, to the extent also, you know, that they cross paths and cause a complete eclipse.
Hell of a coincidence.
Yeah, it's almost as if they are literally very carefully positioned, as if something's sort of almost like driven the moon into orbit. You know, it sounds bizarre, but, you know, who knows? I mean, you know, if we're talking about entities, aliens, that could be thousands of years in front of us. I mean, look how far we've come in 100 years from when the Wright brothers first flew to where we are now. You know, that's 100 years. Imagine 10,000 years. You know, we probably wouldn't even be able to understand the people of that time. So the idea of sort of like mega-scale engineering and even manipulating planetary bodies, you know, I mean, that may be commonplace one day, and it may already be commonplace to somebody else.
Here's another question from the Inception Radio Network chat room. What do you think about Ben Rich's dying words about Skunkworks' ability to bring E.T. home?
Well, yeah, I mean, Ben Rich made a number of interesting comments, and he was someone who, you know, he said that there are UFOs and there are their UFOs, which I think is an intriguing statement.
Yeah.
You know, it's he's making it clear that, yes, we have some highly advanced craft, but whatever's going on, it's not all down to us. You know, and I think that's an important factor, because this allows for this sort of secret space program type scenario to exist, but it also allows for somebody else's space program to exist as well. And I think the fact that, you know, he alluded to this without saying too much, but he made enough significant statements to give people kind of pointers that, you know, he knew what he was talking about, but on top of that, you know, he was sort of subtly pointing people in certain directions, possibly realizing he couldn't say too much, but actually giving them enough to sort of put the pieces together. And of course, you know, Ben Rich is a highly, highly credible person. And again, what would make someone like him talk about this if he wasn't in the know? And I think like a lot of these people, he felt at some point, at some stage in his life, that, you know, the story should come out.
Yeah, there's a lot of those stories too.
Oh, yeah.
You know, a lot of.
I think when these people get older, a lot of them, you know, their conscience is like, well, I should have spoken out. You know, I should have said something. And when they get older, they're like, well, what is there to lose? You know. Even though, you know, the Russians sort of did that first, the Russian space program was only actually very slightly ahead of the American one. There have been plans for a number of years for the U.S. government to create, you know, some sort of space agency. And there actually was like a predecessor which was involved in sort of high altitude and rocketry-based research. It was called the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics. But that was then sort of reworked and remodeled into NASA. And basically by July 58, what was called the National Aeronautics and Space Act had been created, and then, you know, gave birth to NASA. Now, obviously the public face of NASA during that period was that, you know, we're going to go out into space, we're going to explore the moon and hopefully one day the planets, and, you know, do good scientific investigation, which certainly NASA has done. But behind the scenes, there was far more going on, a lot of intriguing stuff. For example, at the very dawning of the creation of NASA...
Well, I think we've got Nick back with us. Nick, you there?
Yeah, I wasn't abducted, don't worry. I think it was just a phone glitch.
Yeah, we were wondering about that. Hey, welcome back, man. It's good to have you back on the program. Got all this nice intro, and then no Nick, and I didn't catch it, so sorry about that, but it's good to have you.
Problem.
So tell us, starting off, your book, when did it come out?
It came out about 2 months ago, and it's called the NASA Conspiracies, and as you can probably guess by its title, it's basically a study of chiefly sort of UFO-related issues relative to NASA, but also some other, sort of cover-up and conspiracy issues that still weird, but not necessarily, UFO related. But and what I tried to do with the book was, there've been a lot of books written solely on things like the face on Mars or, the issue of did we or didn't we go to the moon. But what I tried to do with this one was sort of present to the reader evidence that, although those are, I suppose, primary areas of research with respect to NASA, there's actually they actually contracted with the Brookings Institute to prepare a report, which basically was like a long-term study on the part of the Brookings Institute, where they interviewed somewhere in the region of 200 people in different disciplines like science, technology, future technologies, future trends, that sort of thing. And it was sort of like a document, a lengthy document that was for the attention of NASA and saying, hey, these are the challenges you may have to face in the coming years. One section of the report, I should say, stands out because it deals with the implications for if and when NASA should one day uncover or meet alien life. And the document's important because it talks about not when the general public should be told that alien life's been found, but even if the general public should be told that alien life has been found. And there's a lot of sort of forward thinking in this document because it talks about the stuff that there's actually a lot more going on as well with respect to UFOs, alien abductions, contactee cases, all sorts of things.
That's fascinating topic. Obviously, there's been a lot of ton of controversy about all of it. So, what got you into this? I mean, what got you in this part?
I think more than anything else, what it was that over the years, when you write stuff or you go to conferences and people tell you stories and things like this, when I was sort of casting around for ideas for another book and going through files and notes and things, I found that I'd got a lot of leads on NASA-related stories. Say, for example, far more new leads than I would have on, CIA or, whoever. And the important thing was that most of these stories were, certainly a lot of the witness cases were sort of brand new. And, I think that's always an important thing is that if you're going to write a book, you don't want to just go over old ground. You want to be able to bring something new for people to read. And because I've got all these sort of new stories, new cases and files, I thought, well, why not put a book out on this particular subject? And, hopefully it will inform people, but at the same time, maybe it'll bring in further information where people can sort of validate some of the accounts in the book and, add more to the stories, etc.
So where do you start out in the book? What topic area?
Well, I guess what I tried to do with the book is sort of present it chronologically for the most part. So it begins with the early formative years of NASA. And what basically happened was that, in October 1957, the Soviets launched Sputnik 1, which sort of pretty much sent the entire Western world into shock. The Russians had actually launched a vehicle into space. And then, of course, the Russians got the first animal into space and then the first man into space, the first astronaut, Yuri Gagarin. But even